Israel is being slammed for how its military is handling ongoing protests at the Gaza border. The so-called March of Return has already left 17 killed and more than 1,000 injured. That's according to the Palestinian Health Ministry.
The fact that people demonstrating in a march towards the fence were actually killed by soldiers is alarming.
The annual March of Return is a demonstration denouncing Israeli occupation. Thousands of Palestinians have pitched tents across 5 locations where they're expected to stay for the coming weeks. World leaders have condemned Israeli actions against the protesters and were blamed for applying double standards by the Israeli Prime Minister. RT's Daniel Hawkins explains.
This isn't the first incident of mass Palestinian casualties in clashes with the IDF. Tragically, it won't be the last. The border violence had barely stopped before the criticism of Israel's actions came thick and fast from all directions. The UN Secretary-General was quick to call for a full investigation. The EU's Foreign Affairs chief wasn't far behind. Israel, though, is having none of it. The army was doing its job. If anything, the soldiers that fired live bullets into the crowd deserve a medal, according to the country's defense minister. An investigation? No chance.
They ignore the murder of hundreds of thousands of civilians in the Middle East, but when Israel neutralizes 16 terrorists, they convene an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council. The IDF will not cooperate with any investigative committee. Let them investigate the murders of 500,000 people in Syria and tens of thousands in Libya, Sudan and Yemen.
No punches pulled, and some may say he does have a point. Multiple EU states have taken part in NATO or US-led interventions in Libya and Syria, which have contributed to civilian losses. And of course, they also continue to arm Saudi Arabia. That's despite the catastrophic situation in Yemen. But some world leaders returned the focus to Friday's brutal violence on the Gaza border, with President Erdogan branding it an inhumane attack. And Prime Minister Netanyahu didn't let this go unanswered.
The most moral army in the world will not be lectured by those who have indiscriminately bombed civilian populations for years. Apparently, this is how April Fool's Day is celebrated in Ankara.
A thinly veiled reference to Turkey's tough line on Kurdish groups who Ankara labelled terrorists. Or perhaps to Turkey's ongoing military operations in northern Syria, triggering a further response from the Turkish president.
Hey, Netanyahu, you're an occupier, and it is as an occupier that you are on those lands. At the same time, you are a terrorist.
And the EU itself wasn't exempt from the Turkish president's rhetoric. Don't throw stones from a glass house. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter is an old adage. But today, it seems, human life has become less valuable than political expediency or a good soundbite.
Author Max Blumenthal says it looks like Netanyahu and Erdogan are blaming each other for basically the same things.
I'm slightly amused by the denunciations exchanged between Benjamin Netanyahu and the Turkish leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Both are accusing one another of massive human rights crimes, and both are correct that one another has committed gigantic human rights crimes, Netanyahu in Gaza and against the Palestinian people in general, and Erdogan now in Afrin in Syria. I compared this spat between Netanyahu and Erdogan to the 2004 film Alien versus Predator, where 2 monsters battle one another to the death. And You know, in real life, as I mentioned, Netanyahu and Erdogan are cooperating below the surface. Neither man can claim the moral high ground. So both are basically battling from the moral depths of depravity.